So today I will be discussing and exploring the story of women who have long been invisibilized. Not an easy word to say. Women who have long been invisibilized female prisoners. Women often appear as footnotes in the history of 19th century and 20th century criminal justice. And this may be accounted for by the fact that there weren't many women in prison throughout the period. Now, if we look very quickly, don't worry about it, it's not going to be a long analysis of those statistics, but if you look at the table, you'll notice that in the 1860s, about 20% of those who were sentenced to imprisonment, that is to say, those sentenced for less than 2 years, were women. And if we look at convicts, those who were sentenced to terms that were longer than 3 years, the proportion of women would have been around 11%, and the numbers kept decreasing throughout the period. And yet, because there's always a yet, the majority of women who found themselves behind bars were seen as particularly problematic by prison governors, matrons, doctors, but also journalists, reformers, philanthropists. Less easy to tame than the creatures of the jungle. This is how 1860s women convicts were described by contemporary journalist F.W. Robinson, whose book was actually falsely presented as the very genuine testimony of a prison matron, which it wasn't at all. So if women basically represented a small portion of like Victorian and Edwardian prisoners, they were nonetheless a thorn in the side of many administrators and other moral entrepreneurs. So criminal women were often perceived as, in a way, double deviants who had both flouted criminal law, but also moral law. Once in prison, they also raised very specific issues that were due to their supposed natures, so to speak. They were portrayed as women on the edge of normality, on the edge of femininity as well, and in a way on the edge of a nervous breakdown, which I think I can relate at the moment, given the current situation. So they confronted the authorities with disciplinary issues that were interpreted as very specifically feminine. So I will explain how women were apprehended from above, sort of histoire d'en haut perspective. But then I will also analyze how they behaved, how they experienced their situation from below. So sort of histoire d'en bas perspective, showing how criminal women seem to be precariously poised between criminality, insanity, deviance, and defiance. And yes, I do love when words rhyme quite a lot. So there's two-sided portraits that I will present today. This top-down and bottom-up approach will first lead me to explore the construction of female criminals as troubled and troublesome women. Then I will focus on the daily routine of prisoners who rebelled and defied the authorities. That will be point number 2. Risking micro penalties that they weren't always spared in the name of their sex. So, as a distorted mirror of respectable femininity, the female criminal was often interpreted, often seen as a sort of uberdeviance. A special system was required for her special brand of criminality, which was gradually seen by some, and only by some, as insanity. So this will first lead me to discuss, to explore, to explain why female criminals could be envisaged as uberdeviants. That's my expression. It wasn't used at the time, of course. Then I will examine female life in prison and see that it was a sort of femininity 101 class set in a pretty grim classroom. If you remember what a classroom looks like. And then finally, in this first section, I will describe a limited but clear shift from badness to madness. For the Victorian middle and upper classes, women were considered frail and docile, physically weak and emotionally unstable, inferior to man in terms of intellectual faculties. Now, on a more positive note, ladies, women's emotional and sensitive constitution made them natural carers, dedicating their lives selflessly to their fathers and later on to their husbands and their children. So particularly stress would have been placed on the power of the maternal instincts. Women were, it was supposed, financially and emotionally dependent on men, with their peaceful, their honest, womanly natures, making them unable to break the law. But therefore, the female thief, for instance, presents quite a bit of a problem. Thieving calls for initiative and daring, not qualities that contemporaries would have associated with women. Assaults, acts of violence committed by women raised similar issues because they did not match the caring instincts that were believed to be women's biological heritage. For historian of prison Lucia Zanna, women were simply painted as submissive, innocent, pure, gentle, self-sacrificing, patient, sensible, gentle again, modest, quiet, and altruistic. This is overly simplistic, but it is an interesting starting point. Now, for Arthur Griffiths, who was a prison inspector in the late 19th century, feminine nature was, and I'm quoting, more hysterical, unreasonable, and uncontrollable. It is an axiom in prison philosophy, he wrote, that women are far more difficult to manage than men. Well-known journalist and social investigator Henry Mayhew put it in writing in the 1860s. He wrote, "In them one sees the most hideous picture of all human weakness and depravity, a picture the more striking because exhibiting the coarsest and rudest moral features in connection with a being whom we are apt to regard as the most graceful and gentle form of humanity." So the ideal woman of the period, not the real woman of the period, of course, but the ideal woman of the period was expected to be quite pure. She was expected to remain chaste before marriage and modest and docile once she was married. So the prostitute, for instance, clearly did not match this model. Male sexuality, generally speaking, was regarded as being too strong a force to be confined to the bounds of marriage. And recourse to prostitutes and or mistresses was widely tolerated for men. It was regrettable, of course, but a necessary evil. After all, what were men to do? They had their needs that needed to be satisfied. Whereas women, in contrast, were credited with generally much more modest sexual appetites, and prostitution was seen as an unnatural form of behavior for women. So prostitutes were basically placed at the root of the great social evil, to use an expression that was used in the popular magazine Punch. British doctor J.B. Thomson linked this moral perversion to physical corruption. He wrote, "The women are all ugly in form and face and action, without the beauty of color or grace or regularity of features, and all have a sinister and repulsive expression in look and mien." So there was a sense that basically moral deviance mirrored, or rather physical deviance mirrored moral deviance. Now, to be fair, Thomson also targeted male criminals. According to his paper published in 1870, men had, and I'm quoting, "a stupid set of features and a dirty complexion." So he wasn't particularly kind to men either. The press also conveyed the impression that female criminals were unwomanly, overly masculine, that they were real shrews, or as the paper called them, various papers, viragos. So looking too much like a man could be interpreted as a sign or even as a cause of criminal deviance. And viragos were often associated with biting. So that would give you the impression that there was a horde of serial biters in petticoats that was jeopardizing public safety. Now, once in prison for women, life partly became a crash course in femininity. So the separate system prevails. What does it mean? It meant that prisoners were to spend their time alone in their cells to atone for their sins. Silence was also to prevail at all or at most times. Cells were small and they were furnished only with the basics. What does it mean for the time? You would have had a Bible that would be placed on a shelf, as you should be able to see in the pictures that are on the slide at the moment. You've got a little shelf in the corner of the cell. And you would also have a mattress that had to be rolled up during the day and unrolled at night, as you can see as well in the drawing and the photographs on screen. There would have been a spy hole in the door as well. So you can see it on the close-up on the slides. And the spy hole meant that doctors, matrons, other members of staff, generally speaking, men, would have been able to keep an eye on prisoners, depriving them of their privacy. There is one prisoner, Chicago May, who was very colorful Irish American woman who was incarcerated in the UK in the early 20th century. And she described the spy hole as the eye which never slept, calling it the acme of cruelty. Women would also have a stool to sit on, as you can see on screen, which was particularly uncomfortable, especially for pregnant women. Despite an official emphasis on femininity, not much was done for pregnant women, even though they would have been carrying the next generation of British children. Comfort, if the word can be used, was extremely limited for long-term prisoners during their first months. Florence Maybrick, another famous prisoner, described her cell as a tomb, and I'm quoting, with only a hammock and 3 shelves. Now, it was admitted that the stern, often quasi-military architecture and nature of the Victorian prison was not necessarily the best environment for encouraging feelings of femininity and domestic pride. So, for instance, in Brixton Women's Prison in London, inmates were given the privilege of being allowed to whitewash the walls, sort of paint them white with a special product. Few women prisoners, however, would have seen the inside walls of that particular prison, whether it was whitewashed or not, because for the experience of the large majority of prisoners, stays in prison were actually very short, and sometimes very, very short. Now, the emphasis on inculcating respectability and womanliness was also reflected in the skills that women prisoners were taught once they were in prison. Cleaning, knitting, cooking, and laundry work were often used in prison. You can see on the slide silent work featured in Mayhew's book. And if I move on, you see more pictures of the laundry. So you've got it here on the screen, at the bottom of the screen, the one with the baskets would have been the laundry. So activities were aimed at feminizing those women who had failed in their natural roles as domestic creatures. Laundry work was central, as if, in a way, to wash away the sins that they had committed. In a convict prison in the 1870s, women were employed in, and I'm listing those employments: cooking, baking, knitting, needlework, laundry work, and when the weather's permitted it, making up, rolling and cleaning the footpaths, exercise yards, etc., etc. So work was often intended to rehabilitate women, but it also had the added benefit of ensuring the daily running of the prison. Even though the authorities tended to insist on the curative and the therapeutic role of the work, the financial benefits that were derived from it were considerable. Now, perhaps one last note on the question of Femininity 101. It would be a bit simplistic to assume that laundry work was easy work. It was actually really exhausting work that required strength and muscle. Activities that were meant to feminize women were, in a way, as a result, they were meant to feminize women as long as they participated in the daily running of the prison, as long as they did not disrupt the routine of the prison, as long as they did not foster uncalled for vanity in the prisoners either, who had to remain meek and quite compliant. So there's no time to get into this, but you could find yourself in odd situations where women rebelling would rebel by abiding by certain standards of femininity because they were meant to be quite meek and therefore, for instance, not wearing makeup or things like that. Now, in the late 19th century, high recidivism rates, as well as more general fears for the health of the nation, led to doubts, led to anxieties. Why did so many women reoffend? Was it the result of a biologically corrupted nature? And if previously women had not been of much interest to early criminologists, they suddenly found themselves under the spotlight for this particular reason, because there were many women who reoffended. It was believed that recidivism was a more acute problem for women, and statistics did appear to confirm that particular perception. Most of the prison habitués, as they were called, were not actually dangerous criminals. They were petty offenders. They were seen nonetheless as a major social problem. Towards the turn of the century, late 19th century, many repeat offenders were actually really women. They were less likely to infringe the law than men, but once they were convicted, the reoffending rates for women were higher. So to give you an idea, women accounted for 61% of those convicted 20 times or more. I was going to do 20 with my hands, but realized I only had 10 fingers. So, so they were basically representing 61% of those who were convicted 20 times or more, outnumbering male hardened criminals, even though they only made up 24% of those convicted only once. So we see that there's a huge proportion of those who have been convicted several times that are women. The notorious female criminal Jane Cagebrads, with her fantastic name, was famous for appearing around 300 times in court for being drunk and disorderly. Public inebriety typically resulted in a fine or in a few weeks in prison. And women, while they are accounted for 20% of police arrests for drunkenness, made up 91% of those who were sent to special reformatories for inebriates. So they were not arrested as often for drunkenness, but they were sent to special places more often. Alcoholism subsumed many of the issues that were associated with repeat offenders. If we take a look at a typical prison record from the period, that of Martha Kant's, we see that it reveals that within the time, relatively short time span, 7 years, she was sentenced no less than 30 times for being drunk. So it says drunk, and then it says DO, which means ditto. I don't know how good the quality of the slides are, whether you can read that. But basically, there's a list of the same offense coming back over and over again. Each time she was sentenced for very short periods, ranging from a few days to 3 months maximum. And her only other conviction is for begging, which is also revealing of the social status that women would have had, that those women who came into contact with the criminal justice system would have had. So you had full face and profile pictures of those habitual drunkards that were circulated to places licensed to sell alcohol. Special details were listed in the hopes of spotting, recognizing those who frequently used aliases. And these mugshots, if we can call them that, revealed that there was a very clear gender bias, as women featured prominently in those registers, in those pages, outnumbering men. So if we take the year 1909, not 1999, blast from the past, 1909, 82% of those women, of those featuring in these records were women. The fears that stemmed from recidivism and alcoholism were compounded by a growing concern that the nation's public health was actually in decline because of a growing proportion of mentally deficient individuals. These were the feeble-minded, as they were called. As far as women were concerned, you had prostitution, drunkenness, and feeble-mindedness often considered as synonymous. Feeble-minded women were believed to be more fertile than regular women. So the problem looked as if it was getting worse because it was feared that they would have more and more children. So it was the object of many publications at the time, in official reports, psychiatric books as well, such as the one that you have pictured on the slide. The assumption was that women were at the mercy of their sexuality. Havelock Ellis, a physician from the time, even called for the systematic comparison of women's monthly periods with the dates of the offenses committed, saying, you know, I've got a great idea, basically. I'm going to compare the dates when women have their period because I think that's when they're the most murderous. So what it would suggest is that women were puppets in the hands of their biological nature. While some female criminals were redefined as helpless defectives rather than deliberate sinners, to quote historian Lucia Zemna, I've mentioned earlier on, the bulk of female prisoners was still considered responsible for their actions, and as such, they deserved punishment for breaking the law, but once behind bars, they also deserved punishment for breaking the prison rules if they did. Penal authorities tended to define female criminals as more unmanageable, if you remember, more hysterical, more imbalanced. So you'd think that they were more likely to disobey. Did all women in an eminently subordinate position accept the rules with docidity, as the work of famous sociologist Michel Foucault may at times suggest, you know, when he talks about docile bodies in the prison machinery? Or did women rebel against the rules? Were they docile or not? In the second part, I will first show that giving women a voice is key to understanding their acts of rebellion before, well, discussing, of course, their acts of rebellion, and eventually focusing on the punishment that was meted out to correct those women. How do you correct those that are deemed incorrigible? Now, the question of giving women a voice is vital. The prison accounts that I have focused on so far were mainly written by jailers, administrators, reformers, who observed women from their sort of vantage point high up above the corridors, high up above the dark cells. So with this top-down perspective, little agency is left to the prisoners. And when I use the word agency, what we mean here is the capacity to think on your own, to act on your own, despite social constraints that might limit your behavior. Women thus can seem quite voiceless, and they appear either as docile creatures controlled by the authorities or as unmanageable, unruly creatures controlled by their passions. Well, prison history from below endeavors to analyze the experiences of ordinary prisoners from their own points of view. It aims at accounting for historical events from the perspective not of the leaders, not of the jailers, but of the common people. Generally speaking, with an emphasis on those who have been voiceless, the marginalized, the deviants, but the oppressed as well, the nonconformists, the outsiders, and so on and so forth. So historiographically speaking, we might find ourselves with a problem because those narratives were ignored by many historians who tended to focus on great men. But one of the reasons for this neglect may simply be the lack of sources that were written by those who were marginalized themselves. If we go back more specifically to the question of women prisoners, there were few testimonies, and I'm sure that you can guess why. Most female prisoners tended to be uneducated. So I mentioned Martha Kant and her offense for begging. There was also the fact that silence could be motivated by a desire to remain anonymous to avoid stigma. You didn't necessarily want your name associated with the memoirs of a particular prisoner. Hence the use of aliases. One woman could have dozens of them. But there's also the fact that the filing and the recording of the archives was the prerogative of jailers. So women and men, for that matter, were not given really much of a chance to leave direct and official testimonies. It's not like they were, given space to how do you feel? No one asked them how they felt. So it is hard, basically, to tell the story of these people from their own points of view. There are some memoirs that were penned by prisoners, but they do not reflect the everyday reality of ordinary prisoners, or at least their lives before they found themselves in prison, because those tend to be the works of very unusual criminals, well-to-do criminals, educated women, high-profile cases, or political prisoners. If you're thinking suffragettes, you'd be right. I have mentioned Chicago May, for instance. She is a notorious criminal, and she has this picaresque autobiography. You also had Florence Maybrick, and you should be able to see her face on the slides. She was the author of My 15 Lost Years, but she was American, so she's not your typical British criminal woman due to the fact that she's American. This is the deepest thing I've said all day. She was American, and she was born to a banker, and she came from a wealthy family. So she's not your typical British prisoner for other reasons as well. But that being said, by examining those books, by examining pieces of penal archives, we can endeavor to locate women's voices. So criminal records, even though they were kept by the authorities, they do offer us an insight into the lives and experiences of female prisoners. It's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Some documents that are kept in those records reveal rebellious behaviors. They weren't listed as such, but if you listen carefully, then you might hear those women's voices. There's also, of course, the suffragettes' papers. They were unusual prisoners, but that doesn't mean that their accounts isn't much more of a bottom-down history. So those papers that are kept at the London School of Economics at the LSE in London, they provide historians with relatively unfiltered first-hand accounts of prison life. So you have prison diaries, such as the diary of Katie Glidden, that are of particular interest. You can see that she wrote her diary on an actual book because she didn't have a notebook. And you also have gems like this letter, which is a letter written on toilet paper that was smuggled out of prison. So female prison records, I was saying, can be of some use. They are rife with entries emphasizing the supposed evil ways of women. They were well known for something called breaking out. That's what the authorities said about women. Women are breaking out. Breaking out is imagined here by the widely read graphic, so you can visualize the conception that they would have had of women breaking out. A behavior that was explained by the penal authorities in the following terms. Experience has shown that the prevailing passion of a woman, incensed beyond the control of her reason, is to destroy no matter what property may be within her reach, even if it be her own. She destroys it sometimes with rage amounting to insanity, sometimes with a cool concentration of purpose, which has the appearance, though only the appearance, of a very deliberate intention. So this was meant to be typical of female prisoners, and the practice supposedly proved that women had hysterical tendencies. But of course, maybe you're thinking that we could understand this behavior as a form of rebellion against the humdrum routine of prison life. I think after confinement, not to compare the two, but that desire sometimes to vent and lash out may be understandable. And even Dr. Maudsley actually mitigated his harsh statements when he wrote, "It is not unlikely that the breakings out, which are so annoying to prison officials, are the salvation of some prisoners who, but for them, would go mad." Perhaps we are at times a little inconsiderate in our judgments upon humanity. Prison offenses can therefore be read as a sign of resistance, as a way to restore your agency, especially when prison rules included a ban on talking. Remember, I mentioned the silent rule. It literally meant that women could have a voice, which was stifled, but many kept breaking the silent rule despite the consequences. The breaking of the rules by prisoners shows a desire to fight against the humdrum nature, the routine of prison life and its glum activities. So amongst women, the most common breach of the rules was shouting and singing. Speaking in a rude, insubordinate or loud voice would have been punished as well. Female convict prisoners' records thus offer us a window onto those micro offenses because they're not the offenses that landed them in prison in the first place, but those offenses that they commit once in prison. You can see a sample from these archive on the current slide. This is basically the story of Isabella Riley, who was a 19-year-old girl convicted in 1879 for larceny to 7 years penal servitude. What she had done is she had stolen £10 and a bus in Durham. In 4 years, she was reported 32 times. Most of these offenses, 20 out of 32, involved singing one way or another. She was put in close confinement on a punishment diet and that's going to be the quote I'm going to try and show you so that you can read it in its original context. She was put on a punishment diet for singing disgusting songs in her cell after 7:30 p.m., using a filthy expression, singing and dancing down the ward as she was being taken from her cell. So you can see that singing is clearly used as a form of rebellion against the silent rule. And it must also have alleviated the gloomy nature of prison life. The lewd songs were also probably specifically chosen to shock and get a rise out of the offices, especially knowing what I've said about the way women were seen. There was also breaking glass, which was typical of what the authorities called breaking out. So for that, we can take a look at the criminal record of Elizabeth Fowler. She was sentenced in December 1877 to 7 years for stealing bacon. She broke 18 panes of glass in about 2 years. So that's almost 2 panes of glass per month. I'm not good at maths, so forget that last comment. But she broke many panes of glass. In the case of Sarah Sanders, pictured here on the slides, we can glimpse a different kind of protest. She was convicted for stealing a tablecloth at age 18. And in her file, we find a note that was written by the police constable, and that was then sent to the governor of the prison. So that's why it's in her prison file. And it says, this woman made the most determined attempt on her life in her cells by repeated attempts to strangle herself. So she basically tried to kill herself. After she was sentenced to the felony case, she pleaded guilty to the charge of attempting to commit suicide. The letter goes on a little bit, but then it says she attempted a similar act about 2 years ago by trying to drown herself. She's a very dangerous, revengeful, and sulky girl, is the conclusion. So what we can gather from this is obviously that suicide was a punishable offense, but also that those attempts were not at all seen as cries for help, signs of despair, but rather as the hallmark of bad-tempered and dangerous individuals. This was interpreted as debility by the prison doctor, who then added in his special remarks. You can see a passage from those remarks on the slide. He wrote, of her moral obliquity, there is no doubt, but she's far from being a lunatic in the usual acception of the term. He wrote, she's the incarnation of most things that are devilish. How do you punish the devil? Well, when women misbehaved, the issue arose of what punishment was appropriate. Offenses were subdivided into 4 categories. There was violence, there was escapes or attempts to escape, idleness, not working enough, and other breaches of regulations. So that's the kind of, whatever goes section. Privations were common to punish men and women. They could lose certain privileges, but when I say privileges, what I mean is reading, getting visits, eating regular diets. Corporal punishment only applied to the number of lashes that were given to men, since Victorian notions of the weaker sex meant that corporal punishment was ruled out in their case. There is one historian of crime, Bill Forsyth, who argues that women were seen as emotionally and physically more frail than men. And he wrote, the system was not severe for them. Well, this is hard to deny when faced with harsh punishments reserved to men, such as, for instance, being whipped with a cat o' nine tails. That is a type of whip on a flogging post, as pictured in the graphic. However, there is evidence that the authorities bypassed certain rules by blurring the lines between punishment and restraint. Let me give you an example. Handcuffing was actually forbidden as a punishment in 1865, but it was still allowed as a restraint. You also had things like loose canvas dresses that you can see pictured, drawn in Mayhew's book, that could be used to restrain prisoners officially as a matter of protection. Right, a restraint is not a punishment. It's more to protect the person who's lashing out, protect them from themselves, and perhaps protect others as well. However, in practice, the line between restraint and punishment seems to have been quite blurry. You have a female reformer who declared in 1895 that basically, and that was the title for this subpart. Oh no, not the end. She declared that the handcuffs are very beneficial to naughty, passionate young girls, to quote that female reformer. She argued that the handcuffs are used as a restraint, but the restraint becomes a punishment, although they're not really put on as a punishment. So what we see is that we have physical constraints that could be used as punishment. But physical constraints such as the proper straight jacket, not the loose canvas dress, or the gag. So the gag would have been placed in the mouth so that you can't speak no more. Although these were used in some American prisons, they were not used in Britain. They were considered quite inappropriate there. That's not to say that there weren't some people who regretted that fact amongst the administrators of British prisons, but generally speaking, they were not allowed. Restraints were disproportionately applied to women, suggesting limits to the assertion that was made earlier, that I quoted earlier, from crime historian Bill Forsyth, the idea that the system was not severe for them, because there were ways of going around the constraints placed on punishment. So what we see, for instance, is that 35% of those who were restrained in the year 1880 were women, when at the time, women accounted for 19% of the daily average of prisons. Okay, that was a lot of stats, but that wasn't that much. Really. Also, sorry, I'm ranting, going on about things. But what I meant is that you have a disproportion between the number of people who are, the proportion of people who were restrained, 35%, so that would have been about 1/3, and the proportion of women at the time, which would have been around 20%, so that would be about 1/5, probably. Several types of actual punishment were allowed for women. So you had dietary punishment, loss of privileges, and isolation as well. Isolation in close confinement, meaning in a small cell, in a dark cell, and later on it was not a dark cell, but an ordinary cell that had been stripped of furniture. So that means no bed, for instance. Dietary measures were often deemed dangerous for their weak constitutions, so they were meant to be used quite cautiously. But what's funny about that is that no, it's not funny, but what's interesting is that the most common form of punishment for women was dietary punishment, then it was loss of privilege, and then it was solitary confinement. And many complain actually about the inefficacy of close confinement for incorrigible female prisoners. Indeed, it was seen as quite problematic because, according to some reports, and one in particular I'm going to quote, if women are put in a dark cell, then they shout. If women are put in a dark cell, they sing and make merry. They know there are other prisoners not far off who can hear the noise, and so they like to go on in that strange way. Local and convict prisons were, to conclude, not mere puppets in the hands of almighty puppeteers. Some women defied the authorities at the risk of bearing the brunt of many micro penalties. Their behavior could be quite destructive and disruptive, but it signaled a strong sense of boredom, suffering as well. And it also allowed them to shape their own identities, to determine who they were, if only for short periods they could be themselves. So certain rebellious acts were quite visible. We've discussed breaking glass or singing or chanting. So some were more visible than others, some were more audible than others, but we should not convey the impression that all women broke the rules. Many women conformed. Many women obeyed prison regulations without obvious acts of rebellion. But, because there's always a but, the silent women who leave little to no trace in the archives that historians will go through, they could actually use some strategies that clearly showed certain forms of agency. So what transpires from the bottom-up history of female prisoners is the ingenuity of women, the idea of self-determination that isn't always just about singing loudly or forcefully. It could be just simply shrewd actions and decisions that wouldn't be very visible in archives. The concept of female rebellion in prison should therefore include notions of solidarity, notions of resourcefulness. To give a simple example, in one prison around London in the late 19th century, inmates, the women had invented a system that they called putting the pot on. So what it meant is that they would secretly boil water to make their own tea in their cells using mutton fats and strings that they had stolen to make a sort of makeshift candle. Then they would light it and then they would boil the water. This time really to properly conclude, for some directors, matrons, reformers, journalists, women may have appeared as less easy to tame than the creatures of the jungle, extremely deviant, disobedient. But seen from below, they were often merely trying to determine their own selves, sometimes loudly, sometimes compliantly.